In early 1966, a Viet Cong fighter named Ngo Van Bay walked out of the jungle near his home village of Thanh Son and surrendered to a South Vietnamese government post, ending a chapter of his life he had spent years believing would only end in his own death. He had fought for the cause that had shaped nearly his entire adult life in the province where he had been born, alongside men he had known since childhood. He did not leave that life easily, and he did not leave it for any single, simple reason. Malaria had worn his body down over months of fighting from positions with no real medicine to treat it. The war itself had worn down something else, a conviction that had once felt unshakable and had, over years of hardship and loss, grown harder and harder to sustain. He walked out under an amnesty program built specifically to receive men exactly like him, and he did not know, standing at that checkpoint, what would actually happen to him next. What happened next was stranger than anything his old commanders had prepared him to imagine. Word reached his former unit that Bay had defected, and rather than let that story stand, his old comrades began spreading a different one, telling the villagers of Thanh Son that the Americans had executed him the moment he surrendered, using his supposed death as a warning to anyone else considering the same choice. The rumors spread fast, the way fear-driven rumors always do in a small, frightened community, and it threatened to undo the very purpose of the program that had just accepted Bay's surrender in good faith. The Americans' answer was direct and, by the standards of that war, remarkably simple. They brought Bay back to Thanh Son themselves, alive, visibly unharmed, standing in the village where he had grown up, disproving the rumor simply by being seen. Bay could not know, standing in his own village answering questions from neighbors who had heard he was dead, that he was becoming one of the first examples of a program that would eventually place former enemy fighters directly inside American combat units, trusted with weapons, with intelligence, and with the lives of the very soldiers they had once been trained to kill. That is the story of the men who crossed from one side of that war to the other, and what it actually cost them to make that crossing. Now let me show you exactly how it worked, and why it worked at all. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand how a former Viet Cong fighter came to carry an American rifle into combat, you first have to understand the program built specifically to make that transformation possible, and the real reasons men actually chose it. To understand Bay's path, and the paths of thousands of men who eventually followed a version of it, you have to understand the program that made defection a real, structured option rather than simply a desperate, unsupported gamble. The Shio Hoi program, whose name is often translated as Open Arms, launched in December 1963 as a joint effort between the South Vietnamese government and its American advisors, built around a straightforward premise: offer Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters amnesty, medical care, financial support, and help resettling into civilian life in exchange for laying down their weapons and abandoning the fight. This was, at its core, a psychological and humanitarian effort as much as a military one, built on the recognition that not every enemy fighter was equally committed to the cause he served, and that a genuine, credible path out of the war might succeed where military pressure alone could not. The program's actual results over the course of the war were substantial in raw numbers. Tens of thousands of men came forward through this program across its years of operation, though honest historical assessment acknowledges that not every one of these defections reflected a genuine, permanent break with the other side. Some men used the program for temporary respite from the brutal conditions of guerrilla warfare, before eventually returning to their units. Others were drawn less by ideological conversion than by the practical incentives on offer, food, medical care, and money that a starving, malaria-ridden fighter in the field simply did not have access to any other way. But a meaningful number of these men, Bay among them, made a genuine and lasting break, and it is worth taking their reasons seriously rather than assuming defection was simply the act of the weak or the cowardly. Men who defected cited a real range of motivations: the physical toll of fighting a war with almost no medical support, disillusionment with the specific direction the war and the movement had taken, exhaustion after years of continuous grinding hardship, and for a significant number, a specific and culturally serious fear of dying in combat far from home without proper burial, a prospect that carried weight in Vietnamese culture that a purely military analysis of the program easily overlooks. Defecting through the Chu Hoi program was only the first step, and understanding what came next explains how a man like Bay eventually found himself fighting alongside the very soldiers his old comrades had trained him to consider the enemy. In late 1966, American forces, initially the Marine Corps and soon other units as well, began a program built specifically to make use of exactly the kind of knowledge a former Viet Cong fighter possessed, knowledge no amount of American training could ever fully replicate. These defectors understood the terrain, the tunnel systems, the specific patterns and habits of the units they had once served alongside in a depth and detail that no outside observer, however well trained, could match. The program that emerged from this recognition selected a small number of defectors, trained them further, and placed them directly with American infantry units as scouts, typically at a ratio of roughly 1 scout per rifle company, working alongside the very soldiers they had once been trained to fight. The name given to this program, borrowed from a 19th century American frontiersman known for guiding others through unfamiliar and dangerous terrain, reflected exactly the role these men were meant to play. A scout who had once set traps for American patrols now walked ahead of those same patrols, watching for exactly the traps he once might have set himself. A man who had once known which trails led to hidden supply caches now led American units directly to those same caches, understanding their location and construction in a way no outside intelligence briefing could ever fully convey. This work demanded real trust, built slowly and never automatically, on both sides of a relationship that began by necessity in genuine mutual suspicion. American soldiers, understandably, did not extend immediate confidence to a man who had until recently fought for the other side, and early interactions between scouts and the units they served were often marked by real, cautious distance rather than easy camaraderie. That distance narrowed over time through the accumulated evidence of a scout's actual conduct in the field, warnings that proved accurate, intelligence that proved reliable, and, in more cases than the program's early skeptics might have predicted, genuine courage displayed under fire in defense of the very unit that had once viewed him with suspicion. It would be incomplete, and it would dishonor the real risk these men accepted to describe this transition as a simple, safe transfer of loyalty, because becoming a Kit Carson Scout carried genuine and serious danger that extended well beyond the ordinary risk of combat itself. A scout operating in the same province where he had once fought was, by definition, operating in territory where his former comrades might recognize him, and recognition carried consequences that went beyond simple capture. Defectors were understood by their former units as a specific kind of threat, a walking source of intelligence about tactics, personnel, and terrain that the movement had every reason to want silenced permanently. This made scouts specific deliberately prioritized targets not merely for the American units they now served, but in their own right as men whose continued survival represented an ongoing intelligence liability to the side they had left behind. This danger extended in many documented cases to the families these men had left behind as well. A defector's family, remaining in a village his former unit could still reach, sometimes faced real pressure, intimidation, or worse, as a consequence of one man's decision to leave the fight. This is a genuinely difficult piece of this history to sit with honestly, because it means the choice these men made was never simply a personal one, weighed only against their own safety. It carried real consequences for people they loved, people who had made no choice of their own at all, and some men who might otherwise have defected chose to remain specifically because of the risk their families would face if they did not. And there was a quieter, more psychological cost as well, one that shaped how these men lived for the rest of their service and, in many cases, for the rest of their lives. A man who had spent years fighting for a cause he had genuinely believed in, however that belief had eventually eroded, carried real and complicated feelings about the specific act of turning his weapon against former comrades, former friends, men he had once trusted with his own life in combat. This was not a decision made lightly, and it was not a transition many of these men described in later years as simple or free of lasting internal conflict. The value these scouts provided to the units they served was not abstract or theoretical. It showed up in real, measurable outcomes across countless patrols and countless engagements throughout the length of the war, and it deserves to be described honestly and specifically. Scouts identified booby traps and ambush positions that American units, lacking the same depth of local knowledge, might otherwise have walked directly into, converting potential catastrophes into controlled, prepared encounters. They recognized signs of enemy presence invisible to soldiers unfamiliar with the specific rhythms and habits of the terrain, distinguishing genuine threats from the ordinary background noise of a country still going about its daily life around an ongoing war. They provided real-time interpretation and cultural context that helped American units navigate interactions with local villagers more effectively, reducing the friction and misunderstanding that so often complicated relations between American forces and the civilian population they operated among. And they fought when fighting became necessary with a level of courage that surprised many of the American soldiers who had initially approached them with real suspicion. Official records document scouts earning genuine commendation for actions under fire, some receiving decorations for valor that placed them among the more highly recognized soldiers of any nationality serving in specific engagements. This was not a program that succeeded through information alone. It succeeded in no small part because the men who joined it proved willing to risk their lives directly, repeatedly, in defense of units that had, in many cases, taken real time to fully accept them. The cost of the service was real and documented as well. Of the fewer than 3,000 men who served as Kit Carson Scouts across the life of the program, more than 200 were killed in action, a casualty rate that reflects exactly how genuinely dangerous this work actually was, performed by men who had already once risked everything to leave one side of the war and then risked everything again in a different uniform for the other. It would be dishonest to present this program as an unqualified success story, uncomplicated by real limitations and real controversy, because the honest history of the Kit Carson Scout program includes genuine and serious criticism that deserves acknowledgement. Questions about the authenticity of some defections shadow the program throughout its existence. Historical analysis suggests that a meaningful portion of the men who came forward through the broader Kyo Hoi program were not undergoing genuine ideological conversion at all, but were instead seeking temporary relief from brutal field conditions, intending, in some documented cases, to eventually return to their original units once circumstances allowed. This created real ongoing uncertainty for American commanders about exactly how much trust any individual defector actually deserved. A genuine operational challenge that never fully resolved for the length of the program. There were also real practical limitations in how effectively the program could be implemented. Language barriers between scouts and the American units they served created constant, meaningful friction, since most defectors had little or no English and depended on interpreters who were themselves sometimes viewed with suspicion by scouts wary of infiltration. Cultural and institutional distrust between scouts and South Vietnamese personnel further complicated coordination, a friction significant enough that many scouts specifically preferred assignment with American rather than South Vietnamese units, reflecting deep and, in many cases, well-founded concerns about loyalty and security within their own government's forces. This honest accounting matters because it keeps the story from reading as a simple, uncomplicated triumph of American psychological strategy over a monolithic, unified enemy. The program worked, genuinely and substantially, for many of the men who participated in it and the units they served. It also carried real limitations, real risks of misplaced trust, and a human cost on every side of the exchange that deserves to be remembered honestly rather than smoothed into an uncomplicated success story. Bay served through the remainder of the war in the role his defection had opened to him, and in the years afterward, he thought often about the specific, strange arc his life had taken, from a Viet Cong fighter in his own home province to a man trusted by American soldiers who had once considered him, quite literally, the enemy. He came to understand with time that his own path had never been the simple, clean conversion the program's American architects might have hoped every defector's story would follow. He had not stopped believing entirely in the cause he had once fought for, and he did not spend the rest of his life condemning everything about the movement he had left behind. What he had left was a specific personal exhaustion, physical and moral in roughly equal measure, that had made continuing to fight under the conditions he had been fighting under no longer something he could sustain. His defection had been, in the truest sense, a decision about his own survival and his own limits, not a simple ideological rebirth the way some official accounts of the program preferred to describe it. He thought, too, about that strange homecoming to Thanh Son, standing in his own village disproving a rumor of his own death, surrounded by neighbors who did not yet know how to look at him. Some had welcomed him back with real warmth, relieved simply that he was alive. Others regarded him with a wariness that never fully faded, a complicated mixture of suspicion and something closer to grief, mourning a version of him that had existed before his defection and did not entirely survive it, even though the man standing in front of them very much did, and he came eventually to a settled, complicated peace with the choice he had made, understanding it not as a betrayal in the simple sense his former comrades had described it, and not as a straightforward triumph in the simple sense the Americans who recruited him sometimes preferred to describe it either. It had simply been the choice available to a specific, exhausted man at a specific moment in an impossibly long war, and he had made it the only way any man could actually make a choice like that, imperfectly, under enormous pressure, carrying the weight of it for the rest of his life afterward. Here is what Bay's story, and the stories of thousands of men who followed a version of his same path, actually reveals about a war too often described in terms of two simple, opposing sides. The Chiu Hoi program and the Kit Carson Scouts, who emerged from its most committed defectors, complicate a story that popular memory often tells in far simpler terms than the reality actually supported. This was never, for the men who lived it, a war of two monolithic, unified forces facing each other across a clean and permanent line. It was a war fought by individual human beings, each carrying his own specific mixture of belief, exhaustion, loyalty, and fear. And for a meaningful number of those men, the line between one side and the other proved considerably more crossable than either side's official narrative typically allowed for. That is the real meaning behind Bay's strange, difficult journey, and it reaches well past one man's defection in one province of a long war. Ideology, however genuinely held, is rarely the only force shaping a person's choices under conditions of genuine physical and moral exhaustion, and a war fought long enough and hard enough will eventually reveal exactly how much of any single fighter's continued commitment depends on circumstances that can shift, sometimes completely, given enough hardship and enough time. This is not a comfortable truth for either side of a conflict to fully embrace, because it complicates the clean story both sides generally prefer to tell about the total, unwavering commitment of the men fighting for them. Bay walked out of the jungle in early 1966, exhausted and sick, and walked back into his own village months later, alive, having become something his former comrades needed the world to believe was dead. He spent the rest of the war fighting for the side that had once been his enemy, not because his convictions had simply reversed overnight, but because a specific, exhausted, complicated human being had made the only choice available to him at the only moment he actually had to make it. That is the story of the former Viet Cong who started fighting for America. Not a clean conversion, a survival carried forward imperfectly and honestly for the rest of a long and difficult life. Now you know why his story was never as simple as either side wanted it to be. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the individual, complicated choices that cross the lines a war tries to draw clean on both sides of that long conflict. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam on any side, in any unit, under any flag, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.